Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel for another how-to video. This time we're going to be tackling the 1/72nd scale North American P-51D Mustang starter set. The Mustang is an icon of the sky from the Second World War, and its stunning looks and incredible performance make it a very popular subject with newer modelers. This starter set comes with polycement, a paintbrush and Humbrol acrylics to paint the model, so everything you need for a basic build. On the back of the box you'll find colour diagrams detailing the scheme which is included with the kit. The colour callouts for the supplied acrylic paints are referenced in the small clear boxes with the paintbrush icon, and this tells you how to paint the model. In the smaller red boxes, these numbers refer to the transfer sheet supplied with the kit, and the diagram helps with placement. Inside the box you'll find a large clear plastic bag holding all of the frames with the model kit pieces. Also included in here is a separate bag holding the clear frame for the canopy. This is just bagged separately to prevent damage. In the smaller bag you'll find the 4 Humbrol acrylics and the polycement to glue the model together. The transfer sheet covers all of the markings for the supplied aircraft scheme, and there's the ubiquitous Humbrol Airfix paintbrush to paint the model kit. The instruction guide details the build from start to finish, and it's important that you give this a read before you start the model, as there are some areas that will be inaccessible later on. Also included is the Before You Start guide, which details the common tools and techniques used in model building. We'll cover most of the techniques in this video, however we will carry out part 1, which is to wash the sprues in soapy water before we begin our build. The basic tools we'll use in this video consists of a pair of cutters for removing parts from the frame, a modelling knife to trim away any excess plastic left behind by the cutters, a modelling file to file flush any joining surfaces ensuring a perfect fit, and a pair of tweezers to help with placing the markings at the end of the build. The instructions refers to parts using a letter and number combination, which can be found moulded onto a small tab next to each part on the frame to assist in selection. Also included in the instructions is a colour callout, and we need to begin this build with some painting, so we've taken the number 155 paint included with the kit, and upon opening it you can see that it's separated badly while the kit was in storage. This paint is perfectly usable at this stage, it just needs a quick stir to restore back to its original consistency. After about 30 seconds the paint is ready to use, and using the supplied brush we transferred some of the 155 into our palette. We then added some tap water. About 3 or 4 drops to a small amount of paint like this is sufficient. This will slow the drying time of the paint and allow it to settle down to a smoother finish. It will also reduce the opacity of the paint, so we'll need to apply a couple of coats to build up good strong colour coverage. Using undiluted paint may cover quicker, however the finish holds 3-dimensional texture which looks untidy. By using 2 layers of thinned paint we're able to achieve the same coverage with a much smoother finish. We painted all of the parts that needed to be painted with number 155, and by the time we'd given everything one coat, the first parts were dry completely and they could be given a second application. This increases the opacity, giving the colour a nice solid finish with no 3-dimensional texture. The next step on the interior was to pick out a few of the details with number 33 matte black. This was done carefully, painting up towards the number 155 gradually, until eventually it was complete and it was time to remove the parts from the frame with the cutters and clean them up. After initial removal with the cutters, there's some leftover plastic, as we like to cut a few millimeters away from the visible surface of the model parts to avoid the cutters damaging the surface detail. After that's been cut away, we switch to the file and remove all traces of the connection point. Because these parts have already been painted, this of course exposes some bare plastic, so we simply touch that in with a little bit of the paint we've got left in the palette. This same basic process of using the cutters, followed by the knife, followed by the file, is the same cleanup procedure that we'll use for all of the parts throughout this video. With cleanup complete, a small dot of polycement is added into the cockpit and the pilot's seat is glued into position. Moving on to the two halves of the fuselage, and after removing them from the frame, you'll notice that the connection points are moulded into the mating surface of the parts rather than onto the visible outer surface of the model. This means that cleanup is contained in an area that won't be visible, so it will give a better finish, but it does mean that all traces of the connection point need to be removed or they'll interfere with the fit. After cleaning up the fuselage halves, the cockpit was popped into place without any glue and the fuselage closed up in a process known as dry fitting. This is just to check that everything fits together perfectly. Once this has been carried out and the parts are checked, we can apply the polycement using the yellow areas in the instructions as a guide to where we need to apply the glue. The cockpit assembly is then pushed into place on one of the fuselage halves, and we can apply the polycement for the fuselage join. We don't want any excess glue to bubble out onto the visible surface of our model, so the polycement is concentrated along the inside edge of all the mating surfaces. This way, when the two halves are pressed together, any extra glue will go inside the model rather than out onto the detailed outer surface. With the two halves pushed into contact, clothes pegs are then used as a third hand to hold these parts together while the polycement cures. Once those have been left to cure fully, we've got a perfectly joined fuselage with no excess glue visible on the outside surface of the model. Moving on to the assembly of the wings, these were removed from the frame and cleaned up in exactly the same way that we showed earlier in the video. After cleanup, they were dry fitted to ensure that we'd removed all excess plastic and had a perfect fit, and then we applied polycement in all of the areas marked yellow on the instructions. As with the fuselage, we concentrated the glue away from the outside face of the model to avoid any excess bubbling out. Once the glue had been applied, the two halves of the wing assembly were pushed together, and again we used clothes pegs to secure the two parts together while the glue dried. Polycement was then added along the inside edge of the wing root join on the fuselage. This was pushed into position on the wing assembly, and with a satisfying click this part settles into position. With that complete, we added the horizontal stabilizers after adding a small dot of polycement onto each one of the mounting pegs and pushing them into the corresponding holes. With the fuselage complete, it was time to move on to some of the detail parts, and before we begin painting, we decided to leave these parts mounted on the frame but free up a little bit of space by cutting the frame away from the parts in advance. This just allows us to paint all the way around without needing to clean up so many connection points afterwards. These parts were removed with the cutters and then filed smooth to ensure that we had little cleanup to do further on into the build. The detail parts were then given a couple of coats of slightly thinned down number 33 matte black. This had been diluted with a couple of drops of tap water, just like we showed at the beginning of the video, and this was painted all over the detail parts to act as a base coat for the number 11 silver paint which would follow. All of the parts were given 2 coats of the diluted number 33, and once this was allowed to dry fully, the number 11 paint was opened and given a good stir to restore its consistency. This was again diluted with a couple of drops of tap water, and then the number 11 paint was added to all of the parts that we'd given a black base coat. Adding a coat of black paint to these parts before adding the silver just increases the shine of the number 11 paint and gives it a bit of a richer finish than applying it directly over bare plastic. You'll notice that we haven't been particularly neat when applying the paint to the wheel centres, but that's because we can simply go back in afterwards once the silver's completely dry and neaten up the wheels with a further application of the black paint. This is added from the outside of the wheel working towards the silver centre, and once the bristles of the brush lock in around the raised details on the wheel itself, this helps to guide the brush around. After applying this, the wheels look nice and neat. With the detail parts ready to go in the next stage, it was time to paint the exterior of the Mustang. We began by adding a black base coat because the overall finish on the plane is number 11 silver, And this was done using slightly diluted number 33, and in any areas where the surface tension of the paint caused it to pool on the surface rather than sticking to the model, we use short fast strokes of the brush to break the surface tension and concentrate on just getting one initial smooth coat of paint down. Once this has been allowed to dry fully, we can apply a second coat over the top to solidify the colour. It's essential that you allow the paint to dry fully in between layers. Once the black base coat was added, we slightly diluted some of the number 11 silver paint and added the initial coat of paint over the black base coat. You'll notice that this appears streaky at first, but because we're adding tap water to our paint, this allows us to build up the opacity in multiple layers without worrying about getting three-dimensional marks in our paint. The process is simply repeated at this point 3 or 4 times, with the opacity increasing with each additional layer of silver that we add to the model. The essential thing is that the paint is going down smoothly and that we're not getting any ugly brush strokes or other texture in our finish. With the silver completely dry, we moved on to the olive drab section on the nose of the aircraft. This was painted in, working our way down towards the demarcation line between the two colours. We didn't want to get any of the green on the nicely painted silver areas, so we took our time and worked very carefully. With the painting complete, it was time to move into the final detailing stages. The detailed parts which we'd painted earlier in the video were removed from the frame before being cleaned up with the file. Any areas of exposed plastic were touched in with the relevant colours before the detailed steps were assembled in small sub-assemblies which we could then add to the model in one piece. Here you can see we're assembling one leg of the undercarriage and then gluing that in all in one go. This simplifies the assembly process and we'd quickly added all of the details to the model. The drop tanks are the final detail that gets added in this build, but seeing as we're working on this part of the model, we removed them from the frame and glued them together when we set them aside ready for later on. With the details added, it was time to focus on the canopy. The clear frame was snipped away, leaving us with this convenient handhold, and then any excess plastic removed first with the modelling knife and then cleaned away with the file. We can then paint the canopy's frame using the edge of the brush to pick up those raised details. It's difficult to see on camera, but each pass is adding some of the silver to the necessary areas. Don't worry if you get any of the silver paint on the actual canopy itself, this can be easily scratched away with a sharpened toothpick. Once the canopy was painted, this was pressed into position and with a satisfying click the canopy is added. The last detail to get glued into position were the drop tanks, and with a small amount of polycement on each mounting point, these were dropped into place. With the assembly complete, the final stage is to add the markings. These need to be cut free from the sheet using the modelling knife before being immersed in tap water for a few seconds and then set aside to soak. After being allowed to soak for about 2 minutes, the transfer will move easily under gentle pressure from a paintbrush. This means it's ready to apply. Some water is added to the model's surface to aid in repositioning, and then the transfer can be gently guided into the correct location using the diagrams on the back of the box to aid in placement. The back of the modelling knife can be used to make larger moves, or you can use the paintbrush, and then the excess water is wicked away with some tissue and that's left to dry. There aren't that many markings to add in the kit, but the level of detail that they add and the splash of colour that they bring to the finish really make the model pop, and what we're left with is a lovely little replica of the P-51D Mustang. There's just one last thing to do in this build, and that's to add the model to the shadow base which comes supplied with the kit. We've painted ours with matte black, and the base simply slots into the hole on the bottom of the aircraft. And that completes the build of the Airfix P-51D Mustang starter set. It's easy to see why the P-51 is such an appealing subject to aircraft modellers. As a beginner to the hobby, it might seem a bit daunting to try and build a replica of such a unique and interesting aircraft, but by offering the Mustang in the starter set format, Airfix hope to bring it to within reach of even the most novice modeller. With a reduced parts count and improved build sequence, the P-51 starter set is the ideal intro to the hobby. So as always, thanks very much for joining us today for some modelling, and we hope to see you again in the near future. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time.